welcome to everybody for joining us. I think most people have come in through the doors that we kind of expect so far. And my name is Terry Leventhal. I'm the director of the Cockburn Association. And I'd like to kind of welcome you to this, the very first Cockburn Conversation being held kind of digitally that forms part of the Doors Open, Edinburgh Doors Open Day program. And this is quite a special program for us because this is our 30th year in organizing Doors Open Days. And holding these talks and lectures as part of it is really at the very heart and the very essence of Doors Open Days, which is set up as an event to help the public get in behind doors that they're not usually able to do so. And it's in that spirit that our Cockburn Conversations this year, running over this week, is about looking at the kind of hidden and contested histories of Edinburgh, getting behind the doors of some of the stories that we know, or at least we think we know. Now, as your guest, we're using Zoom as our digital platform, and for regular attendees of Cockburn kind of meetings, you'll notice a few slight differences of functionality. We're using a webinar package, which means that for those attendees, your video and microphone functions will be disabled for the duration of the event. However, you can still participate with us using the Q&A or chat functions, and by sending us questions, we'll be moderating those and feeding them back to Sir Geoff and Professor Hague as we go along. We're also attempting to be posting this live on Facebook, but having a few little wrinkles. But if you're listening to it and you kind of want to tweet, please do so and use hashtag Cockburn Conversation to link it up into kind of our event. And I have to kind of say this because I'm duty bound because my chairman is here. In bringing you the Doors Open Days this year, is I'd like you to kind of think, if you enjoy this evening's discussion or you look forward and see our program going forward, perhaps you might wish to become a member of the Cockburn. We are a membership organization open to all, or even make a small donation to us by going to our website, and you'll find the membership of the donation functions kind of in there. That'll help us in our work in preserving the wonderful amenity of this city. So without any further ado from me, and I'm going to kind of take myself down off the video, let me kind of introduce you to our host for the evening, our chairman, Professor Cliff Hague, who, with our guest tonight, Professor Sir Geoff Palmer, will be discussing Don't Pull Down the Statues, Pull Down Racism. Professor Hague, over to you.
Thank you, Terry, and welcome everybody, and special welcome obviously to Geoff. So we're going to really focus tonight around the work that Geoff's been doing on the Scottish links into slavery, and in particular the connections here in Edinburgh. So can we start off, Geoff, by asking you, how did you get involved in this work that you've been doing? When did it start, and what drew you into it? Maybe the latter is a pretty obvious question, but you know, you're a busy man. How did you take this task on?
Well, I started it in about 2005, just before I retired. I thought, you know, what am I going to do when I retire? And I started to look at this history. And the first thing I did in 2005 was to send to Jamaica for a telephone directory. I don't know why I did that. I think I was lateral thinking as I do my research on barley. And my cousin sent me a copy of the Jamaica telephone directory. And when I looked at it, I was very surprised because of over 60% of the names, the surnames in it were Scottish surnames. You know, there were about 2,500 Campbells. And I calculated that in terms of square area, there were more Campbells in Jamaica than they were in Scotland. And that stimulated me to do some work, but the real stimulation came, you know, in 2007, when we had the commemoration of the abolition of the slave trade, 200 years. And what I found at the time, there were a lot of Scottish people. I was giving lectures, and a lot of Scottish people from 2007 to now. One of the consistent responses to my lectures was, why hasn't anybody told us this before in terms of our historical links with slavery? And I think that is what has driven me in a sense that this is our history. You know, Scottish history and Caribbean history is really one. And therefore, I feel that the Caribbean people, we owe it to them. And we also owe it to the Scottish people that, you know, this is our history and it should be known, because I think it would help to reduce racism.
Thanks. Yeah, you're absolutely right that many of these stories have not been told. I mean, I've got quite a lot of books on Scottish history and on Edinburgh, and I was looking through them today, and I've just picked a couple out, but there's really no mention. I've got this very weighty tome here. Can you see it?
Yes, I can.
Collins Encyclopedia of Scotland. Now, it's produced a few years back, I agree, but you go to the index, is slavery there? It's not there. You know, there's so many entries, you know, so many things in it. Bit here about Libster in Caithness, Luss in Dumbartonshire, etc., but slavery doesn't feature in there. And also,
Right.
I went to my copy of Making a Classical Edinburgh, and I just picked out, if I can just read this this one bit, one or two sentences from this. The growth of wealth in Scotland after the middle of the 18th century was a prerequisite to the development of the new town. Profits made in industry and trade, rents drawn from mining and agriculture in an increasingly prosperous countryside. These certainly formed the financial basis of private development in Edinburgh, though the banks, they also helped to finance, and through the banks, they also helped to finance the schemes for the town council. So there's mention of trade and other sources of income. But again, you know, the word slavery isn't actually there. And I also have to confess, you know, I wrote a book in the 80s, which looked quite a lot at the development of Edinburgh, and I checked myself out on that. And again, I pretty much talk in general terms. I don't actually use the word slavery. I pick up this growth of trade. So why do you think there's been this gap in our knowledge that it took a retired brewer to unearth?
Well, I think that, you know, I read somewhere recently, and I think it just about says it where, for example, let's take the famous case, the Joseph Knight case, and that was between 1774 and 1778. And what it was is a very famous case. You know, it had 12 judges. Some of the most distinguished legal minds were involved in that case. Henry Dundas, which we'll talk about later, was involved in that case. The Solicitor General was involved in that case. Some of our most distinguished lawyers were involved in that case. And that case was supposed to be a case that abolished slavery in Scotland.
Could you maybe just explain who Joseph Knight was? Because not everybody may know.
Okay. Well, Joseph Knight was a black man, he was a youth, who was brought from Jamaica by his owner, Sir John Weatherburn. And that boy was brought to Scotland. And he lived with Sir John Weatherburn in Perth. And he decides to run away because he didn't want to work for Sir John Weatherburn anymore in Scotland. And the case went to court, and it eventually ended up in the Court of Session with these 12 senior judges, as I said, Henry Dundas, the Lord Advocate, the Solicitor General, all to decide whether this young man, you know, could leave his owner in Scotland. And the result was the courts freed him and said, okay, you can go. But historians and a lot of other people have taken it, and I've taught it. I even speak to black people, and they know about it in terms of the results. And the result was the court freed Joseph Knight in 1778, and that date has been taken, that Scotland abolished slavery. Now, my view is that nobody's been able to define the slavery that Joseph Knight was in. And what Henry Dundas said during that case, and he was the young Lord Advocate then, and he said, there are no slaves in Britain, and there cannot be because of his constitution. So we have a case which the Scottish people have been told that they were involved in the abolition of slavery before British slavery was abolished in 1838, many years later. And that has given many Scots a sense of, we were involved, but not directly, because we abolished it. And it's completely untrue. The point is that Joseph Knight was not a slave. You know, my view of slavery and the British people's view of slavery in terms of that time was about Black people being slaves. And therefore, Black people were chattel slaves. They had no right to life. They were property. And being property, when the slaves were emancipated, the slave owners, 46,000 of them, got money for their slaves because the slaves were property. Joseph Knight was not in that category. Scotland didn't abolish slavery. And this is part of the self-serving myth put around by some academics and other people. And they think they're trying to cover up for the Scottish people. Well, the Scottish people I've met have said they want to know their history, and they dare anybody to try and hide it from them. And that's why we're in this position that, as what you've said, books have been written, you know, recent books have been written where there's about a page or a line on this slavery. And therefore it is something that historians and people believe. They are defending the Scottish people. They are moderating this history for them. And this is not accepted by the Scottish people. This must change, because it is this denial why we have racism in different parts of the world, but also in Scotland, because people feel, well, we weren't involved, we didn't do anything, so this racism, we have to do nothing about it. And a lot of Scottish people have told me, well, it's also the past, Geoff, you know, and we weren't involved that much. And I try to point out, also to historians as well, the past has consequences. And therefore, we have to address those consequences. And I've said before, we cannot change that history, but we can change consequences such as racism for the better. And therefore, what is terribly important, this history must be taught in schools. It must be in the curriculum. And we must, in fact, get the Scottish people to realize that if we go to Glasgow or Edinburgh, to Aberdeen, to the Highlands, this history is there. It is almost within walking distance of where most people are. And I think that what is great is that the work we're doing, like this program, this is the people, the government in Jamaica has taken notice that the Scottish people are doing something about this history in terms of looking at it, and what Glasgow University has done in terms of looking at their relationship with slavery. They came to the conclusion that they were involved. They received legacies, about 200 million, and they've set up educational relationships with Jamaica, with the University of the West Indies. They've set up scholarships for Black BME students, and therefore they have lit a first light, which others are following. And I think that to deny this history is to deny the suffering of millions of people whose efforts built, you know, our streets, are lots of our stately homes. You know, we've got Jamaica Street just about in all our big cities. And therefore, I feel that the Scottish people must be treated as they are. They're adults, very responsible people. But somehow people have taken it upon themselves to manipulate this history for self-serving reasons, and that is wrong.
Can we probe this history a bit more then? Because my understanding is that after the 1745, Scotland kind of hooked into British colonialism, and with that more fully into the slavery that was being practiced in aspects of the empire. And then, as you said, there's this famous case of Joseph Knight, and I just want to pick up a bit on the role of Dundas in that, because clearly there's been significant controversy in Edinburgh here about his statue, and I know you've been involved in trying to craft a form of words to inform people about more fully about Dundas. But you know, his supporters, if you like, say that this understates the role that he played in the Joseph Knight case, where he spoke up for Knight as an advocate and against Wedderburn. And I think it was Boswell writing to Johnson, who says, "I cannot too highly praise the speech from Henry Dundas, generously contributed to the cause of the," apologies, "sooty stranger."
Yeah.
And apparently, you know, Dundas said, "Human nature, my lord, spurns at the thought of slavery amongst any part of our species." So what's the case really then that Dundas, who made those kind of actions and statements, deserves to be, or needs to be, reconsidered in terms of his role in relation to slavery?
Well, that was, say, 1776 when he said that. You know, this was at the beginning of his career. But what nobody has ever said when they read that out is that Henry Dundas also said that every black man in Jamaica is a slave. He was actually reaffirming slavery in the Caribbean. The fact is that, to me, that case essentially was like a put-up job to try and balance the case in England in 1772, when, you know, Lord Mansfield said, you know, a slave owner couldn't take a slave out the country. And I think that there was this sort of, well, England has done that, we've got to do something. And Dundas, a lot of the legal references to that case, he drew from England. You know, Lord Holt said, you know, if a black person is in England, then, you know, he can't be a slave because he'd be dead, because the air is free in England. And Dundas alluded to the same thing about, you know, freedom in Scotland. So he's saying, yes, Joseph Knight was freeing Scotland, but if he went to Jamaica, he'd be a slave. Yeah, and therefore, that's a sort of hypocrisy.
Yeah, this is following, I think it was the Somerset case in England, is it? Yeah.
In England, yes.
Yes.
The Joseph Knight case followed that.
Okay, but what happens after that with Dundas when it comes to the vote in Parliament on abolition?
Well, this was, as I said, he was saying all this stuff about Joseph Knight in 1776. Fast forward to 1792, a few years later. He was then Home Secretary, he got into the government. So he was a new MP, Joseph Knight. Later on now with gradual abolition, he's a mature politician. He's in the government of Pitt, famous Prime Minister. And he was now battling with William Wilberforce. But what one has to see about what Dundas says, you know, he also said slavery was bad. A lot of them did. There was this hypocrisy at the time. If you say something is bad and then you still do it, that somehow absolves you. It was quite common. And therefore one can't take anything that one says. For example, Dundas also said slavery was bad. Coulson, the abolitionist, said so. That's what he said, but he opposed abolition. Now, in 1792, William Wilberforce was putting forward the bill for immediate abolition of the slave trade in 1792. And the Dundas came along with his supporters. Remember, a lot of the Scottish MPs and lords were in Dundas's pocket. You know, he did so many favors for so many people in this country. He could do anything he wanted. So he said, no, the slave trade should be gradually abolished. And Michael Fry, the historian, actually, I was reading what he said today. You know, he said, well, what else could he do? You know, the fact is that, you know, we needed the economic benefits from the slave trade. So how can we abolish it? So he was giving, that's his justification for Dundas's slowing up the abolition of the slave trade. And Dundas, once he got that amendment for gradual, he never did anything that gave you the impression that he wanted abolition. Clarkson said he was the chief instrument of opposition to the abolition of the slave trade for 15 years. And during that period, about 630,000 Africans were transported from Africa to the Caribbean to please slave owners, because the average life of a slave was less than 10 years. And that's why you need a trade to replace them. And Dundas even had a strategy to breed young slaves in order to compensate for the trade when the trade stopped. So he, during the whole period of gradual, it was a ruse. Because if you have gradual, then you can say to the powers that be, we're going to abolish it eventually. And that's what kept it going. And the Prime Minister Pitt regarded gradual as never. Fox, the MP, very famous member of Parliament at the time, Fox equated it to gradual murder. And therefore, Dundas, when he was impeached for taking Navy's money, that man took money from the instruments of defense of the country. This is during Trafalgar. That's when he was impeached in 1805. They found out that he was taking money, he and Trotter, you know, who owned Moulton Hall estate in Edinburgh. Both of them were accused of taking money. Dundas was impeached. In 1806, he had to resign from the government, and he was removed from the list of privy councillors. And that was the end of his political career. So he slowed up slavery, the abolition of the slave trade for over 15 years. And at the end of it, he was impeached. This is the irony. And the irony of it, he was impeached in 1806. The slave trade was abolished in 1807, 1 year. So how could it be abolished in 1 year?
But
when it took him 15.
Can I put a question to you though? Do we know that the bill in 1792 would have been passed in its original form had Dundas not proposed the insertion of gradual? In other words, could it be seen as a tactical way to get the bill over the line in terms of, yes, certainly watering down the content, but nevertheless getting a majority vote in favor of the general principle? You know, could it be argued that he was actually making a kind of tactical amendment in good faith, if you like, rather than in the cynical way that you suggested?
No, it's not being cynical. I'm just saying it was a strategy. It was a deliberate strategy on his part. And it was this the slave owners like the Baileys from Inverness, and the Houstons and the Malcolm of Poltolloch, people, all those slave owners, the Oswalds. Dundas had he was their king. And the point is that he didn't want the chance of it being abolished. So there is a nonsense there that, oh, it wouldn't have got through. How do you know that if you didn't have gradual, it wouldn't have got through the next year? One is being a prophet, about this. And Clarkson, the abolitionist, it's not my words. He said after Dundas was impeached and had to resign, he was the chief instrument of opposition. That means if he wanted abolition, he'd be working to get it. During that period, he spent all his time, fighting wars in the Caribbean, ensuring that slavery continued in Jamaica. He sent out Lord Balcarres to ensure that slavery continued efficiently. So it's this nonsense.
So what should we do with this statue?
Well, the point is that despite, this is the truth of the matter. When it was put to me after the Colston statue was taken down, and I said, no, that's part of our history, that statue is. In fact, when he was impeached in 1806, his supporters, were concerned about him, especially slave owners. And there were celebrations, even though he was impeached, in St. Andrew Square. I've just found that out. And the point is that that's where his statue is. And thus it was put there for a reason. Now, my attitude is there's a story to the statue going up. There's a story why it was put there and who paid to put it up. There's also the history of what he did. It's been there for about 199 years. And therefore, it's an integral part of the history of Scotland and slavery, my ancestors' history. And I don't see, we can't change history anyway. If you take it down, it doesn't change that it was there. And therefore, my view is that it should remain. It is part of our history, but we should put a plaque on it. And the plaque should carry the truth of what he did. We can't put everything he did on it. Michael Fry wrote a book, and he called it the Dundas Despotism. But when he wrote that book, and this is the thing about historians, which is frightening, when he wrote that book, he was glorifying what Dundas did. And what he said, that when Dundas was impeached, he was guilty of villainy, rotten to the core. But then he said, that was the past. The past has consequences. And I think the Scottish people deserve to know something about who that man was, because it's about us learning from his deception.
So can you...
And not doing that again.
Can you update us on the current position with the proposed plaque?
Now, what is fascinating about that is, I spoke to a young lady from Bristol who was filming near the statue just last week. And she was for, statues down. And she was pleased that the Coulson statue, had come down. And I said to her, how long did it take for the council to consider a plaque for it? And she said, years. And I said, what are now the council's view now that it's come down? And she said, somehow, I think they're relieved. And I said, that's the point why statues should not come down, because it is more difficult for people to accept the truth of slavery on a plaque than for a statue to come down. And therefore, what we now are doing in Edinburgh is that the council had set up a committee, which I was on for 3 years, with Michael Fry, the historian, the present Viscount, the 10th Viscount, Ramsey, a young man called Ramsey, and myself, and a councillor. And it took us 3 years, and we got nowhere, because the Viscount, which is a descendant of Dundas and Fry, didn't want slavery on the plaque. In fact, Fry calls it a minor incident, 630,000 people being enslaved, a tiny minor incident. And therefore, what happened was just before the George Floyd crucifixion, which has changed the world, the council had banned the committee, saying, you know, we're getting nowhere. And because of that, the committee was recalled. And within 5 days, we had a narrative for that plaque. And it says that he gradually abolished the slave trade and caused, over 15 years, over 500,000 people to be transported into slavery. That's the narrative now, but the council has put out a consultation on planning permission. And that has caused a sort of differences of views. And the vote was close. But the supporters for the plaque, I think, won the vote. I believe in democracy, and it had gone the other way, I'd have accepted it. I think the next stage is the council now has to consider or debate other aspects of the installation of the plaque. So there is still a view there, and which you've expressed, you know, that, and, you know, Dundas was not a bad guy, you know. He selected Balcarres to be governor of Jamaica when he you know, after 1792. He sent Balcarres out to Jamaica, I think, in 1794. And he's corresponding with Balcarres all the time. While Dundas sent British troops to Haiti next door to destroy the Haiti slave industry because he didn't want it competing with Jamaica. The Haiti slave industry was French. And Dundas lost 40,000 British troops in Haiti in order to protect Jamaica, which had 300,000 slaves, and it was the British sort of central source of funding from the Caribbean. 300,000 slaves in Jamaica, whereas the other parts, I think the total slave population, British, in the Caribbean was 800,000. Jamaica had 300,000. So Jamaica had to be protected. And that's a man who was gradually abolishing the slave trade during that period.
Okay, thanks. You've mentioned Balcarres, who's another name, of course, that crops up in Edinburgh, not far from where I live. We have Harris Street. And a number of these things have now come up. I want to just move on a bit because of the time from Dundas. We know very recently, University of Edinburgh took on the issue about David Hume Tower, not the architectural issue, which was a concern for the Cockburn Association many years ago, but the issue about the name, and they suggested changing the name. Again, how does Hume figure in this slavery debate from your perspective?
Well, he was before Dundas. So you're talking about the 1750s. And he sort of got up one morning and just said, you know, in his view, non-white people are inferior to white people. And he said, you know, and he made special reference to Negroes. And the point is that he also said, when he was told that there was a Negro in Jamaica which had some abilities, Hume actually said he was a parrot, that he was imitating white people. And he and Kames, one of the judges in the Joseph Knight case, had alluded to, you know, Negroes being different species. And therefore, by different species, they were connecting them to apes. And the point is that Hume did not know his taxonomy, because human beings are not different species. Human beings are all fertile, all of us. And our children are fertile. Species, children are not fertile. And therefore, the descriptions that Hume gave to Black people have remained. And the irony is that the slave owners at the time, you have the greatest brain saying that black people are inferior. In the Joseph Knight case, there was a lawyer saying, white people can't take the sun, black people can, so they can be enslaved. And this concept from the 1750s came from Hume. And therefore he is responsible. And the point is, because it's the past, one says, you know, it's the past, we don't have to. The past, you know, we today will be the past of the future. And what we do today, people will look back at it. And I hope that somebody won't be saying in the future, well, that we had to do what we did, all the racism they had, what else could they do? And I just think Hume was a very able, very clever man. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was providing an excuse for the enslavement of black people to justify it academically. And therefore our academics today who believe they are justifying the Scottish people behavior by saying they abolished slavery, you know, with the Joseph Knight case, are equally guilty. And the point is that we must stop teaching this kind of nonsense. We must explain to people exactly what happened, because racists will take it and kill people. And somehow it is not, you know, we can't mince our words anymore, because a lot of black people has died. I remember somebody rang me and said, look, Geoff, you know, my skin, I'm white, but I'm poor, and my skin doesn't offer me any sort of benefits. And I said, okay, let's you and I walk down the street in an American town in the South, say in the 1920s. And I said, I'll be killed before you, even though none of us has done anything. Therefore, skin color has been used to separate people with on no scientific basis whatsoever. Our hearts are the same color, so are our minds. And therefore, all this nonsense that it was the past, it will tell us that we've got to behave properly, or people will hold us and our descendant responsible.
So can you maybe just, we're going to round up in a few moments, but do you want to just say something about how slavery has impacted on Jamaica today?
Well, it is, I'll give you an example. I gave a talk on climate change. And, you know, Jamaica, the name comes from, you know, Jamaica. That's the Arawak, the Arawak Indians, people who lived there before white people went there. And it means land of wood and water. And the point is that I was listening to Jamaica Prime Minister speaking a few weeks ago, and he was saying, you know, to put new pipes to take water to parts of Jamaica was going to cost $25 million. And the point is, this is the island of, you know, wood and water. The point is that when the slave owners went to Jamaica, they cut down all the trees, or most of them. There were so many plants, Jamaica was covered with coffee and sugar plantations. The soil, when it rains, it moves. We have gullies everywhere. The point is that the government is still fighting to deal with the consequences of slavery, which Henry Dundas drove during his period. He never went to Jamaica to see what was happening there. You know, he was living in Melville Castle in Dalkeith. So people who don't know the consequences of this slavery. And therefore, somehow, what Glasgow University did by acknowledging it as, you know, the present Viscount won't acknowledge anything. You know, he didn't even know who Whitbread was, you know, who impeached his ancestor. He called me a brewer. sort of to denigrate, or denigrate what I had to say, that 3 historians. It was a lie, because in fact Sir Tom Devine said he didn't associate himself with him. So we have people who will manipulate, do things which are not true, in order to protect a man, which actually destroyed a lot of people's lives in the Caribbean. And I'm not for, reparation in terms of thinking people are going to give a bag of money. The point is that what I would like is to understand what has happened there. And it's wonderful. I've had 2 families whom, after listening to this history over the years, are now contributing to my church in Jamaica. And I think that to me, that is wonderful. Nobody's told them to do it. They're doing it themselves. And I know there were 13 churches a long time ago in Scotland who was sort of contributing to the Caribbean. And I know there's a church in Inverness that's doing the same, not far away from the Bailey family, who were Dundas's, they loved Dundas because he prolonged the slave trade for them. So we have a great change is happening, and it's coming from ordinary people, not from the government. And therefore, it is wrong that we have people who are trying to deceive the council, trying to stop the plaque when they have no good reason for doing so. I want them to provide me with the evidence that Dundas was an abolitionist and that Joseph Knight was a slave. In fact, you mentioned Boswell, and this is the deception of the time. Boswell, the year before Dundas gradually abolished the slave trade, Dundas is talking about, gradually abolishing the slave trade. Wilberforce was struggling. Boswell wrote a poem in 1791 to say that slavery should not be abolished. Boswell wrote a poem to say slavery should not be abolished. The slaves were quite happy on slave plantations.
Okay, thanks then. I think our time is probably up for if we're going to get some questions. So I'm going to hand back to Terry with many thanks, Geoff. And Terry will pick up some of the questions that have been coming in over the last 45 minutes or so.
Well, thank you very much, Cliff, for that, and thank you very much for that stimulating conversation. There's been a lot of questions have come in before we began, and certainly an awful lot more since then, and there's just simply no way we're going to be able to cover them all. So I'll try and group them so that we can get through most. There's been a lot of questions that have come in about how we can educate people about the subject matter that you've been talking about, Sir Geoff. In particular, how would you recommend we get it into the curriculum? And kind of what thoughts do you have about not just thinking about the school children, but how we can inform adults about their wider history as well?
I think I'm going to give a talk in a few days on the curriculum, and a lady is going to try and push that. The fact is, I'm not an expert on our educational system, but this has to come from the government or from the educational authorities. The school can't just change their curriculum. The present circumstances is something I learned in the north of Scotland, where somebody said, at the moment it's nice to do, meaning that you can do it if you want, and you don't do it if you don't want. The point is we must get it formally into the curriculum, exactly like maths and physics and English, because it is the only way that we're going to change attitudes. I was in the school up in Inverness, and I was speaking to some young children, and I said, they were about 10 years of age, and I said, who has heard the N-word? And 80% of the hand went up. The teachers were embarrassed. Therefore, we need this history in the curriculum. Now, for adults, what can we do? I've given lots and lots of lectures around Scotland, and various organizations have asked me to speak, and I've done this. And other people are giving talks, not just me. And the point is, I think that it is that sort of relating with the public, and programs like this, relating with the public, has brought about a significant change in attitude, which in fact didn't come from the universities or came from the schools. So I think a combination of education in the community and also, in fact, a formal to introduce this history into the curriculum, both are important. And why is it important? I went to give a lecture last year at the festival in St. Andrew's Church, who've just asked me to help them with some of their equality work. And when I arrived, the attendant said, you know, why are you here? And I said, I've come to give a lecture. And she said, what time? And I said, 2 o'clock. And she said, well, you can't be giving a lecture at 2 o'clock because that lecture is being given by Professor Sir Geoff Palmer. And equally, I went to another one of her institutions not long ago, and I was told, you know, I couldn't get in. And the doorman said, you know, do you know anybody in there? And I said, yes, I used to know the boss. And he said, were you his chauffeur? So therefore, people's perception of Black people are still with Hume. And unless we have better representation in our society, people are going to assume that Black people have only got the capacity, as Hume suggested, in 1752 or 3.
Brilliant, thank you kind of very much for that. And on that kind of theme of interpretation or reinterpretation, we've had a question in, do you think that all local authorities should initiate a review of public monuments kind of in their patch, and potentially using creative opportunities, artwork, or all sorts of different means to begin telling the story? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that, you know, the chairman just talked about Balcarres Street, and we have a councillor from that area, you know, supporting the Viscount. He has no idea that Dundas and Balcarres was an awful pair in terms of running Jamaica. In fact, his governor became one of the most successful slave owners, Balcarres. You know, he and his son, the 7th Earl, he was the 6th. So Balcarres Street, for example, you know, what do we do about that? We have various, the trouble is, I don't believe we can start taking stuff down, as I said before, because we will then have to start taking down the Gallery of Modern Art. You know, we'll have to take down, you know, Jamaica Street. We'll have to take down the New Town, because a lot of people who live in the New Town benefited from, you know, from slavery. We can't do that. And I think that the main thing we can do is to put up, where appropriate, plaques that are true, stating what these people did, the benefits they gained, and the suffering that Black people on a plantation don't know why they're there. It's like somebody coming into your house now, to your house now, or you're walking down the street and you disappear. Your family don't know where you are. They're never going to know where you are. And you don't know why you're moved. That's what this slavery was about. So when the 10th Viscount and his crew, that's what they should think. Somebody should come and take them away now. They don't know where they're going, and that's the end of their existence as a human being. That's what this slavery was about. So we should put up plaques. I don't want things knocked down.
That's kind of brilliant. It takes me on to a series of questions or queries we've kind of had come in about the kind of nuances of the determination of the storyline, or perhaps where the historical truth lies. As we know, every day passes and we learn something kind of new. What's the kind of best way in your mind for ensuring the most accurate information goes forward for this kind of reinterpretation or this kind of redevelopment? Would there be particular things you would be looking for, or approaches you would advocate?
I think, like with everything, you know, we should go back to primary sources. If from an academic point of view, if I'm doing work on grain, this is what we tend to do. We go back and look at primary sources. Sometimes it is impossible to find them. The Joseph Nye case is essentially based on a newspaper report. And the newspaper report, you know, there's witting and unwitting aspect of that. You know, so therefore, you know, and we've abolished slavery on a newspaper, you know, the Caledonian Mercury, which were at bias. So we've got to look beyond sources like that. And we also have to be prepared to go to take the record from Jamaica or take record from here and not manipulate them. There are records there. It is the way they've been used. And for example, Michael Fry put that Dundas was going to take 20-year-old men and 16-year-old black girls and breed them. Now, when he wrote that, he never, you know, imagined that George Floyd would occur. Now he says Dundas is a gradual abolitionist, but he equally say that Dundas, you know, was prone to villainy, and you know, and was guilty of taking the Navy's money. The point is now he's a gradual abolitionist because, you know, he's now working for the Viscount. And I just think that we've got to look at the history dispassionately because the evidence is there. It is just how it's been used to influence public opinion.
Okay, that's kind of brilliant. Now we've got some questions that came in when we put a plea out kind of on Eventbrite for pre-questions to come in, and as two professors and educationalists, I'm sure you would want me to reward people who've completed their homework early. So to put them out, one person has kind of asked that if we're retaining the statue of Dundas in St. Andrew's Square, do you think it would be appropriate to have similar recognition of people who campaigned for the abolition of slavery also in that same public space? And he kind of notes that Jane and Eliza Wigham, you know, who were prominent members of the Edinburgh Ladies Emancipation Society. Would that be kind of something you would support?
Well, yeah, I think that, you know, we can't have statues everywhere, you know, but there are certain people whom I feel that should be there because it is not going to, they're gone. You know, I think Dundas didn't give a bag of bean when he was alive, much less now he's not here. The point is that statues and plaques have an educational purpose. The fact is, somebody texted me the other day and sent me a picture of some children reading the temporary plaque that the councillors put out, standing reading it. And therefore, I feel that Wigan and other people who've made significant contributions, there is a very deficit of recognition of women who played a significant part. It was a woman who actually said slavery should be immediately abolished, you know, before the men. So, and, you know, the point is that these people should be recognized because it shows a balance, which I think is important.
Brilliant, thank you. It's also a very good plug because on Friday we will be asking the question, where are the women when it comes to the monuments in kind of Edinburgh as well? So a lovely kind of link kind of into it. And I've got perhaps two more questions that could relate to subjects that we've already kind of discussed, and to try and tie the two kind of aspects together. One is around the lack of Scottish history teaching in the curriculum, which you've kind of mentioned.
Mhm.
And I just wonder if you have kind of thoughts. There's been a lot of questions about how do we kind of break down those kind of barriers of getting that kind of story kind of taught. So we'll start with that one and we'll move on to the next one.
Okay, well, history is, you know, the thing is about history, people didn't give it the importance in the past, which it deserves, because it's telling us about, you know, how we achieve what we've got, and how we've either suffered or we make other people suffer. It's part of our culture. And, you know, many members of my family members are psychologists. And what they tell me is that the actions of history form part of our culture. And what they say as psychology is that culture is like genes, that it's inherited, it's passed on. And it's difficult to change a cultural attitude, difficult. And therefore, we must teach history and we must teach it honestly. We mustn't manipulate it because it is part of our culture. It becomes part of our custom and practice. And therefore, history is now critical in terms of changing attitudes. It is critical in terms of teaching about, you know, racism. And we must get rid of people who are making statements, you know, like the Viscount, without any evidence whatsoever, because he's got an agenda. But I would like to say to him, if somebody comes and takes his family away, and he has no clue where they're gone, that's what Henry Dundas did to my ancestors. And that must not happen again.
Thank you very much for that. And it's kind of worth also noting that Viscount Melville is kind of with us in our kind of attendees.
Yeah, I can see.
and you know, there's, I think that one of the reasons behind this, that there are issues around hidden histories and contested histories. And it's about having the open and critical kind of debate that kind of comes on with that. And I think and perhaps this is a subject that we may in the Coburn need to come back to as part of a wider discussion of monumentality, which
I agree.
We're just kind of starting. We'll take that as kind of affirmation of the need to do it. And kind of one final point, I'm conscious of the time, is somebody has suggested to get your kind of view on the proposals of establishing a national museum of colonialization or colonialism. Which could be either on a UK basis or on a more kind of local based endeavor. Do you see something like that as being a useful tool in helping further the debates and discussions?
Well, yes. In fact, I can assure you, I will be involved in that aspect of our history. I don't want to give anything else away, but I will be involved, and I regard it as a great honor. And the thing is that we have different parts of Scotland which have links with slavery. The Scottish government has actually stated they want this aspect of our culture looked at. And therefore, to me, it is a very mature, it is very important because of what I said earlier, that our history must be not only understood, it must be protected. And I don't want statues to be put in museums where, you know, removing from their context. You know, a statue has a context. You know, Henry Dundas is looking at his relative, the Earl of Oakton, you know, which is across the road in the Royal Bank of Scotland Garden. You can't take that away, you can't change that, because you'll be changing that context. And therefore, some things will go in museums, some things will stay exactly where they were put. And we hope for the future that Scotland will lead the way. You know, we were involved in slavery without a doubt. You know, I've got 3 to 5% of genes from Shetland. They didn't come from Africa. A lot of Caribbean people have got not just Scottish names, we've got Scottish genes. The fact is that that is no big deal to me. It's part of my heritage. And therefore, what I hope, and what a lot of other people hope, and we're going to try and do this, is to ensure that our history is protected, respected, and will be freely available for all to see. And the world will see us as a country where we're not ashamed for the good or bad that we do. What we're going to try and do is to try and correct those things which, you know, of which we were not or should not have done. The point is that what we've got to understand, we're one humanity, nothing less, and Hume was wrong.
Well, Sir Geoff, I think that that's an absolutely brilliant place to hand back now to Professor Cliff Hague to kind of sum up tonight's Cockburn Conversations before I kind of wind up this formal event. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you,
Geoff.
Okay, I just really want to thank everybody who's taken part, both most obviously Professor Sir Geoff Palmer, Cherry, for chairing it, the many people who've been sending in questions both beforehand and then commenting during the discussion, and also to our backroom people who've made this possible from the Coburn office. I think what has emerged is a quite wide-ranging discussion. I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. I think we need to work towards getting a shared understanding. That's obviously difficult. It's you know, we've all got ancestors. We've all got a sense of identity with them. I admit I don't know how far mine go back, not very far from what I know. But clearly there are emotive issues here. But by having hopefully conversations like this, overdue conversations like this, hopefully we can move towards a better mutual understanding and enrich our understandings of the city that we all love here in Edinburgh. There will be other performances and discussions later in the week which will explore other aspects of these themes. Terry's already mentioned, I think, Wednesday with, Friday with the Where Are the Women? But some of the other themes touched upon, racism in America, other Black histories in Edinburgh, and also very dear to my own heart, the Coburn's, the activities of the Craig Miller Festival Society. All these are coming up on later days this week, so we hope people will be able to join us on them. And with that, I'll hand back to Terry.
Thank you very much, Cliff. So it just kind of falls to me to wind up the kind of proceedings tonight. It's been a really stimulating kind of discussion, and clearly I think as my chairman has said, that there's more discussions to kind of take place, perhaps with a broader kind of panel as well. And that kind of reminder, all through this kind of week, the Cockburn Conversations will be taking place. Go on Eventbrite and you can book your tickets for the kind of rest of the evening. We'd encourage you to kind of do so. And later on this kind of week, we'll be launching the full program for the Digital Doors Open Days, which runs this coming kind of weekend with something like well over 60, almost over 70 kind of venues participating with some kind of virtual offering. It'll be absolutely kind of fantastic. And to spare kind of a thought in bringing this to you of, as I've said at the beginning, to consider going on to our website, coburnsassociation.org.uk, and becoming a member. We would encourage you to do so, or perhaps even considering to leave us a small donation. It would be most appreciated. And with that being said, thank you all kind of very much for participating. Thank you very much to our two conversationalists of this evening, Professor Cliff Hague and Professor Sir Geoff Palmer, who've given us a really stimulating kind of evening. And hopefully we'll have more of those discussions and stimulations later on throughout this week. Thank you all very much for coming.